welcome back to Unit 3 to one of our design concept lectures. This is yet another unit where I'm actually trying to squeeze in two different design concepts in for this design part of the lecture in Unit 6. And that's just because there are so many important design concepts that need to be covered. For one, to help make sure that you're able to do your analysis paper properly. And so the last design concept that we just talked about in Unit 6 was value, and that was very important. But we also, since we're talking about the Baroque, I think it's a really good time to start talking about composition and how that relates to page structure, or what you might call page geometry. And so we'll actually be talking about composition and design in a number of ways over the next number of units, next 3 units probably. And so, pay attention and keep in mind that this content is going to be very helpful in terms of relating to your first paper and to your second paper. So the main point, to sum up the whole point of this argument of this lecture, is the idea that anytime we look at a picture, the picture is contained in a border, in a frame, right? Usually that's some sort of rectangle, right? Like the Madonna of the Meadows right here. And then that rectangle, that border, has implied a certain structure to it. Our eye, whether we try to see it or not, our eye automatically knows roughly where the midpoint of this line is, where the midpoint of this line is, and that one right there, right? We know where the corners are, and we know where the diagonals that go through the corner. And therefore, because we know all those things, our eye is also pretty good at figuring out where the pure center of that rectangle is. Right? And we also are aware of other sort of geometries, like the diagonals that go from the corners to the midpoints as well. And through that, we're also kind of aware of where perfect thirds are. Perfect thirds can be very, in terms of either horizontal but also vertical divisions of paintings. And so because our eye, without us even trying, our eye can see this. And actually, if we were doing this as an on-campus class, I would start this lecture first with just holding up like strings or pieces of wood, like a lattice trim, and just asking people, holding up in front of everyone in class and seeing if people could figure out exactly where the midpoint of that piece of wood is, right? And we could also do that with angles. You could hold up a piece of paper with a 90-degree angle and then hold up another line and see if people could figure out exactly where the 45, the exact halfway of that 90 angle. And what you would find is that everyone is really good. If you kept asking them, like, is this closer to the middle? Is this a little bit further away? That people would almost always get within an 1/8, 16th of an inch of perfect center really easily, regularly. Our eyes and our brains do that really, really well without us trying hard, without us even aware of it. We can make divisions of halves and make assumptions based off of those divisions of halves pretty easily. So, and then based off of that, one of my main premise here in this article, and this is kind of based off of a lot of people, but primarily of the work of Rudolf Arnheim. And the premise is that since those geometric structures of any rectangle are built in, and our brains and our eyes are aware of it automatically, because of that, those locations have a certain type of power, a certain sense of attraction, and sometimes repulsion, depending on how you use them. And there are certain things that artists can achieve by either lining things up with those lines and points of position and power, or by playing off of them, or staying away from them. So let's look at another little proof. Okay, so here's a little bit of a proof of my point, which is that, here we have a rectangle. It's a nice looking rectangle, seems pretty comfortable, and there's a dot in it. And when you're just initially look at it, the dot looks like it's perfectly in center, but probably most of you have already started to realize that that dot is not, and that it's a little bit off. And you may also notice, if you're really kind of intuitive about this stuff, that with that not being perfectly in center, there's a type of tension that's created, a certain kind of energy that's both potentially positive, but also kind of a negative kind of thing, like a thing that's irksome, that's a little bit bothersome. Now, just because it's negative doesn't necessarily mean it's bad in terms of art. Tension and anxiety can be a really useful thing in art. I mean, after all, why do we have horror movies, right? Then look at this little bit of a change, right? Now, um, at first, it looks like this pairing, where we took the same dot and we added another dot, looks a little bit more balanced because now the center, the pure center of the canvas is a little bit, or the rectangle is in between them, almost at perfect half. But I think actually the more you look at it, the more you realize that this is also a little bit off, right? And that it's just a little bit off from where the like center should be right about there, not on the line between them. And so that in a way, it's actually in some ways even a little bit more uncomfortable than the first dot. And so it was based off of experiments like this that Rudolf Arnheim started to come up with a series of theories about how this actually takes place in art, right? And he actually, literally made diagrams like this and had subjects test it as to which locations seem to have the most tension, the most potential movement, or seem the most stable. Like perfect center seems the most stable, right? Obviously, of the ones here, this position here seems the least stable, having the most movement. And and one of the things that he kind of found, and definitely I feel I have noticed myself, is that oftentimes it's the locations that are kind of near, but not quite near those kind of areas of well understood kind of central positions. Those are, or well understood geometries of the page. It's those spots that are almost, but not quite, that sometimes can be the most, um, have the most tension, have the most kind of potential movement, the most anxiety. So let's take a look at this in practice. Well, I'm going to go back to the first page just for a second for you to see a little bit how in Renaissance compositions, we often see compositions based off of triangles. And the triangles are usually centered, right? And how that creates a certain kind of order and balance. And notice also how certain things are located in very important spots, okay? But let's take a look at how it works in these two paintings. So I've talked about St. Francis and Ecstasy before in terms of the narrative a little bit. And so here we have a painting that is the story of a saint who has removed himself from his life, from the urban life, from the life of people, society, civilization. He's removed himself to the wilderness. He's living in a cave, right? Trying to kind of come to grips with his faith and try to understand God. And we have in this painting a representation of that moment, right, where he's kind of like enraptured. He is feeling the presence of the divine. And one of the things I find interesting is how in this painting, the geometry of the painting, the corner to corner diagonals most especially, represent, right, the divine itself. I often tell students, like in this particular painting, God is represented by the math, right, which is a very Greek philosophical way of approaching the divine. Ooh, that's my 1 minute warning. All right, so the last thing I want to say about it is, so take a look at how he uses the tree and the cloud to kind of create sort of an arc to remind us that this is an angle. Now, the actual diagonal that goes through his heart, right, is a little bit off from the perfect diagonal. It goes that one right there. So I put them both there for you to see the relationship between the two. But still, the way he's using those measurements communicates the story. All right, I'm going to end there. We'll get back in just a second.